Darkness still held Ciudad Juárez when the first call came in. A single driver, making his way across the near-empty streets before sunrise, slowed his car and froze. Hanging from the overpass above him, silhouetted by headlights, were two human figures. Their bodies swayed with the early morning wind, bound by ropes, a message too loud to ignore. They were not hidden. They were meant to be seen. By the time dawn broke, the secret was gone. Commuters who took that highway, factory workers, school teachers, parents on their way to drop off children, all witnessed the same sight. And there, stretched across the bridge above them, hung a Narco banner. White cloth. Letters in bold red. Names. Codes. Threats. The banner flapped in the breeze like a sinister flag. The words were unmistakable. They called out rivals. They mocked the authorities. They warned the people, this city belongs to us. Cartels don't whisper. They scream, in ways the world cannot look away from. And this was only the beginning. Hours later, in neighborhoods far from the bridge, another message was waiting. A burned-out SUV left abandoned at the corner of a street. Around it, scattered containers, plastic bins that once carried narcotics. And beside them, the body of a man. Beside him, another note. Short. Brutal. It ridiculed the police, don't go stealing it. By mid-morning, the city was awake, and so were the sirens. Police units raced from one scene to another. Blue and red lights painted the walls of sleeping neighborhoods. Journalists rushed in with cameras, fighting for footage, careful not to step too close. Yellow tape blocked off streets as reporters whispered into microphones, another message, another body. But Juarez was not finished receiving messages. Later that same day, another Narco banner appeared on a different overpass. This one carried an address, a location. It spoke of houses. Of graves. Of people buried beneath concrete and dust. 30 names whispered in the graffiti of death. Suddenly, whispers spread across the city. Were there mass graves hidden among them? Soldiers soon poured into the streets. They brought canines, shovels, warrants. Behind quiet homes, behind block walls, they dug. The ground gave way in places, the smell rising before the truth did. Some rumors were false, some terrifyingly real. Each new banner sent soldiers racing to another part of the city, searching for graves, searching for answers. Maps soon circulated. Hand-drawn, copied, passed between neighbors and police. Each one marked with streets and neighborhoods, the supposed burial grounds. Red circles, black XS, lines pointing to houses with locked gates. People whispered in mercados, in taxis, in school courtyards, is it true? Is there one near us? Fear moved through Juarez faster than the soldiers could. But the people of Juarez were not strangers to fear. The city had survived wars before, cartel wars that stretched across the 2000s, waves of shootings and kidnappings, corruption scandals that left scars on entire neighborhoods. Yet this was different. Public. Deliberate. A theater of terror. And behind every statistic, behind every headline, were families. Mothers who woke to find their sons missing. Fathers who feared leaving for night shifts. Children who learned to walk to school without looking up at the bridges above them. This wasn't just crime, it was a city learning to live under the shadow of its own streets. So here's the question, who ordered this? Which organization had the power, the will, and the cold strategy to turn an entire city into their message board? And why now? The answers lie ahead. Because what Juarez woke up to on that spring morning was only the beginning.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
Juarez. A city of borders. A city of contradictions. At first glance, it looks like any other bustling metropolis of the north, Traffic pushing through avenues, factories humming at dawn, neon signs flickering above crowded cantinas. But look closer, and Juarez is not just another city. It is a gateway, a crossing point between two worlds, Mexico and the United States. A place where goods, people, and ideas have flowed for decades. And where shadows have always followed closely behind. The border is both lifeline and curse. For some, it brings opportunity, maquiladoras, those massive assembly plants where thousands of workers stitch, weld, and assemble goods bound for U.S. markets. For others, it offers an escape route, dreams of crossing over into another life, another world. But for the cartels, Juarez is more than a border town. It is a prize. A choke point. A vein through which billions of dollars in narcotics can flow north. Whoever controls Juarez, controls one of the most lucrative smuggling corridors on earth. For decades, the Juarez cartel was the undisputed ruler of this territory. Founded in the 1970s and fueled by Colombian cocaine in the 80s, it grew into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the hemisphere. Its leaders operated with brutal efficiency, bribing officials, expanding routes, and stamping their dominance on both sides of the border. But power attracts enemies. And by the early 2000s, rivals emerged, chief among them, the Sinaloa cartel under Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. A war ignited between Juarez and Sinaloa, fought not in jungles or deserts, but in the crowded streets of Juarez itself. For years, the city became one of the most violent places on earth. The violence of those years scarred the city permanently. Between 2008 and 2012, nearly 10,000 lives were claimed in the so-called Juarez War. Entire neighborhoods were emptied as families fled. Businesses shuttered. Journalists were silenced. The streets, once alive with music and chatter, fell quiet at night, replaced by gunfire echoing in the distance. And yet, amid this bloodshed, daily life had to continue. Children still went to school. Workers still crossed the border for shifts. Mothers still stood in line for groceries, looking over their shoulders at every sound. Juarez became a city where ordinary life coexisted with extraordinary danger. By the mid-2010s, as arrests, killings, and shifting alliances took their toll, the Juarez cartel fractured. Offshoots rose in its place, La Línea, the armed wing loyal to Juarez remnants. Street gangs like Los Aztecas, longtime enforcers, became major players themselves. But Sinaloa had not disappeared. They pushed relentlessly into Juarez territory, bringing their own enforcers, their own banners, their own ruthless tactics. The city became a chessboard, its streets divided not by neighborhoods but by allegiance. This block belonged to La Línea. That one to Los Aztecas. The next, claimed by Sinaloa. For ordinary residents, the map was invisible, but the consequences were not. Locals learned to live under tension. There were unspoken rules: don't drive certain roads at night. Don't ask questions when you hear gunfire. Don't stare at convoys of tinted SUVs when they roll past. A look, a word, a wrong step, it could mean the end. Still, there was resilience. Music still played in bars. Families gathered for quinceañeras. Life clung stubbornly to the city's bones. Juarez refused to disappear, even as it was being carved apart by forces bigger than any one family. And then, there were the banners. Cartel propaganda stretched across bridges, hung for all to see. At first, they were words, threats, warnings, boasts. Locals called them narcomantas. But in time, words were not enough. Messages had to be made louder. They had to be burned into memory. What came next would redefine the very meaning of public violence in Juarez. Because soon, the messages would no longer be written in ink and cloth. They would be written in lives. And Juarez would awaken to something it had never seen before. It began quietly. At first, the messages hanging from bridges were just cloth and paint. Threats scribbled across white sheets. Names. Warnings. We control this street. Stay out or die. For the people of Juarez, these banners were chilling, but they were words. Then, something changed. The first bodies appeared in the early hours, under the cover of night. Drivers on their way to work stopped in horror. There, dangling from an overpass, was not just a message, but a man. Bound, lifeless, suspended for everyone to see. His body told a story no words could. The cartel wars had entered a new phase. Violence was no longer hidden in alleys or behind closed doors. It was displayed, elevated, hung high above the city like trophies. Each body carried a message. Some were cartel rivals, warnings to others who dared cross the line. Others were police officers accused of betrayal. Sometimes, the victims were innocents, chosen to send a broader signal: no one was safe, no one untouchable. For the people of Juarez, driving beneath these overpasses became an act of terror. Every commute could reveal a new horror, a reminder that the city itself had become a stage for death. The cartels knew what they were doing. Hanging bodies was not just murder, it was psychological warfare. It was about control. It was about fear. Every display told the people of Juarez the same story: we are here, and the law cannot protect you. Even the police, tasked with cutting down the bodies, were shaken. Many officers whispered that removing these grisly messages was more dangerous than leaving them. Because with each body taken down, another would appear the next night. And then, the numbers grew. 1 body became 3. 3 became 5. Entire groups of victims, bound and hung together in cruel displays, left across major intersections like grotesque billboards. Juarez became a gallery of death. Each overpass another canvas. Each victim, another signature in blood. But this was not chaos for chaos's sake. Each act was calculated. Each body was part of a larger battle. Because the cartels weren't just fighting each other, they were fighting for the city's soul. For territory. For dominance. For the right to say, Juarez belongs to us. The war between La Linea, Los Aztecas, and the invading Sinaloa cartel turned every street corner into contested ground. And the people of Juarez were forced to live in the middle of it. Imagine being a parent, driving your child to school, only to see a body swaying in the wind above the road. Imagine walking home after a late shift and finding a corpse pinned to a billboard with nails, left like a warning sign. These images weren't just shocking, they were unforgettable. And that was the point. To make sure no one forgot who was in control. Fear spread faster than bullets. Families began avoiding certain roads. Neighbors whispered about which bridges were cursed. Some residents stopped going out altogether, retreating indoors after sunset. Juarez became a city under curfew, not enforced by law, but by terror. And while fear kept the people silent, it also raised one haunting question: how far would the cartels go to make their point? The bodies were no longer just warnings to rivals. They were messages to the government. Messages to the media. Messages to anyone who dared stand in the way. Each one escalated the war, step by step, body by body, until Juarez became infamous not for its culture, or its border trade, but for its death toll. And as the war spiraled further, so too did the brutality. Soon, the messages would not only hang from bridges. They would be left in plazas, in cars, even outside police stations. The bodies across the bridges were only the beginning. Because as Juarez descended deeper into the cartel war, the messages became louder. More public. More brutal. And soon, they would no longer be content with shadows hanging in the night. By the late 2000s, Juarez was no longer just another border city. It had become a battlefield, a place where life and death unfolded in broad daylight. The bridge bodies had shocked the world, but in Juarez, they were only the beginning. Because soon, the cartels sought not just to terrify, but to dominate every waking moment. It began with public executions. Gunmen storming into restaurants, dragging rivals from their chairs, and shooting them in front of families eating dinner. No whispers, no secrecy, only the sound of gunfire, plates shattering, and people screaming as they dove for cover. Every public killing was a statement: we can touch you anywhere, at any time. Then came the massacres. Convoys of SUVs rolled through neighborhoods, their windows tinted black, their rifles bristling from open doors. They targeted safe houses, parties, even rehab centers. Rival gang members were gunned down in bursts of automatic fire, but innocents were caught in the crossfire too. Entire blocks became killing zones, marked by bullet holes and blood on the pavement. And yet, the violence wasn't random. Each killing had layers of meaning. Each body was another letter and a message written in fear. One group would massacre the allies of another, not just to kill, but to force the city to watch. The people of Juarez weren't just bystanders. They were the audience. The cartels had turned their war into theater. And the stage was everywhere. La Línea and Los Aztecas, loyal to the Juárez cartel, fought ferociously to defend their city. But the Sinaloa cartel was relentless. They wanted Juárez, its bridges, its tunnels, its routes north. And they would stop at nothing. Drive-by shootings became daily occurrences. Bodies left in trunks, dumped in rivers, or abandoned on highways. To live in Juárez was to live with death as your neighbor. And still, the messages grew bolder. Cartel hitmen began leaving their victims in the busiest parts of the city. Bodies dumped in plazas at midday, limbs scattered across markets, severed heads placed on sidewalks with notes pinned beside them. The cruelty wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was about erasing the line between ordinary life and terror. For the people of Juárez, fear became routine. Parents warned their children not to look at what was hanging on the bridges. Shopkeepers learned to close early when SUVs circled the block. Journalists risked their lives just by writing the truth, and many paid the price. Silence became survival. Everyone knew what was happening, but few dared to speak. But even silence had its limits. In 2010, Juárez saw one of its darkest nights, a massacre at a birthday party where 15 young people, most of them students, were slaughtered. The attackers claimed they were targeting rivals, but most of the victims had nothing to do with the cartels at all. The city's grief turned into outrage. Parents wept in front of cameras, shouting, "Why our children?" But even in grief, fear lingered. Because everyone knew that raising your voice in Juárez was dangerous. And still, the war did not stop. If anything, it escalated. Entire convoys of soldiers patrolled the streets. Military checkpoints dotted the city. Helicopters circled overhead at night. But even the army could not erase the grip of fear. Because the cartels had embedded themselves so deeply that every attempt to root them out only created more chaos. Juárez was bleeding, and there was no end in sight. The bridges, the massacres, the plazas, each was a chapter in Juárez's nightmare. But as the years dragged on, one question echoed louder than the gunfire. How much more could a city endure? Because even as Juárez reached its breaking point, the cartels weren't finished. Not yet. By the mid-2010s, the war for Juárez began to cool. Thousands were dead. Families destroyed. The cartels had torn the city apart, street by street, bridge by bridge. And yet, Juárez still stood. Its people had endured years of fear, but survival came at a price. The scars of the war were everywhere. The first scar was silence. Even after the gunfire quieted, conversations stayed hushed. People avoided names, avoided questions. To speak too loudly was to risk everything. Entire generations of children grew up learning an unspoken rule: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. The second scar was absence. Families torn apart, fathers never coming home, brothers missing, mothers lost in crossfire. Empty chairs at dinner tables. Entire neighborhoods hollowed out. Some streets stood quiet, not because peace had returned, but because those who once lived there had fled, leaving only boarded doors and graffiti-stained walls behind. The third scar was fear itself. Even as homicides declined, the memory of terror remained. Residents flinched at fireworks, mistaking them for gunfire. A convoy of SUVs still made stomachs tighten. Even laughter at night carried a nervous edge, as if joy itself felt dangerous. And yet, Juárez endured. Maquiladoras roared back to life, sending trucks north to the border once again. Families reopened shops, rebuilt homes, tried to stitch together something resembling normal life. Survival itself became an act of defiance, a declaration that the city was more than the war that had scarred it. But survival did not mean forgetting. Memorials began to appear across the city, candles, crosses, photographs taped to walls. Names of victims whispered in church prayers. Mothers marched, demanding answers for missing sons and daughters. Though many cases would never be solved, the families refused to let their loved ones vanish into silence. The journalists who remained carried another scar. Many of their colleagues had been killed or silenced, yet they kept reporting, documenting crimes, naming the dead, reminding the world that Juarez's story was not finished. Every article they published was an act of courage, every headline a gamble with their lives. And then, there was the youth. Those who grew up in the war years carried memories darker than their age should allow. Some chose to resist, studying, building careers, fleeing the shadows of the cartels. Others, seduced by the lure of quick money and power, stepped into the cycle themselves, continuing the war in new forms. The future of Juarez rested uneasily on their shoulders. For all its scars, Juarez was not broken. It was hardened. Changed. But not erased. The city became a symbol of brutality, yes, but also of survival. Of people who refused to disappear. Of a community that clung to life, even when surrounded by death. Still, one question haunted Juarez, a question whispered in homes, in churches, in hushed conversations: would it ever happen again? The gunfire may have quieted, the bridges may no longer bear their gruesome messages, but the memory lingers. And for many, the fear that history could repeat itself lingers too. Because in Juarez, the scars of yesterday are never far from the streets of today. By the mid-2010s, the war for Juarez began to cool. Thousands were dead. Families destroyed. The cartels had torn the city apart, street by street, bridge by bridge. And yet, Juarez still stood. Its people had endured years of fear, but survival came at a price. The scars of the war were everywhere. The first scar was silence. Even after the gunfire quieted, conversations stayed hushed. People avoided names, avoided questions. To speak too loudly was to risk everything. Entire generations of children grew up learning an unspoken rule: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. The second scar was absence. Families torn apart, fathers never coming home, brothers missing, mothers lost in crossfire. Empty chairs at dinner tables. Entire neighborhoods hollowed out. Some streets stood quiet, not because peace had returned, but because those who once lived there had fled, leaving only boarded doors and graffiti-stained walls behind. The third scar was fear itself. Even as homicides declined, the memory of terror remained. Residents flinched at fireworks, mistaking them for gunfire. A convoy of SUVs still made stomachs tighten. Even laughter at night carried a nervous edge, as if joy itself felt dangerous. And yet, Juarez endured. Maquiladoras roared back to life, sending trucks north to the border once again. Families reopened shops, rebuilt homes, tried to stitch together something resembling normal life. Survival itself became an act of defiance, a declaration that the city was more than the war that had scarred it. But survival did not mean forgetting. Memorials began to appear across the city, candles, crosses, photographs taped to walls. Names of victims whispered in church prayers. Mothers marched, demanding answers for missing sons and daughters. Though many cases would never be solved, the families refused to let their loved ones vanish into silence. The journalists who remained carried another scar. Many of their colleagues had been killed or silenced, yet they kept reporting, documenting crimes, naming the dead, reminding the world that Juarez's story was not finished. Every article they published was an act of courage, every headline a gamble with their lives. And then, there was the youth. Those who grew up in the war years carried memories darker than their age should allow. Some chose to resist, studying, building careers, fleeing the shadows of the cartels. Others, seduced by the lure of quick money and power, stepped into the cycle themselves, continuing the war in new forms. The future of Juarez rested uneasily on their shoulders. For all its scars, Juarez was not broken. It was hardened. Changed. But not erased. The city became a symbol of brutality, yes, but also of survival. Of people who refused to disappear. Of a community that clung to life, even when surrounded by death. Still, one question haunted Juarez, a question whispered in homes, in churches, in hushed conversations: would it ever happen again? The gunfire may have quieted, the bridges may no longer bear their gruesome messages, but the memory lingers. And for many, the fear that history could repeat itself lingers too. Because in Juarez, the scars of yesterday are never far from the streets of today. History does not end neatly. It lingers. It echoes. And in Juarez, the echoes are everywhere. Walk down its streets at dawn, and you'll see new paint covering old bullet holes. You'll see families sweeping doorsteps where gunfire once erupted. You'll see children walking to school past corners where bodies once lay. Juarez does not erase its scars. It lives with them. For years, the city was a name whispered in fear. Journalists called it the murder capital of the world. To outsiders, Juarez became a myth, a place of endless killings, of bridges carrying messages written in blood. But the truth is more complicated. Juarez is not just the war. It is not just the cartel. It is not just the graves. It is also the resilience, the stubborn survival of those who refuse to leave their home behind. Still, the memories weigh heavy. Every family here has a story: a cousin kidnapped, a neighbor disappeared, a father who never came home. These are not just statistics. They are names. Faces. Lives that will never return. And when the city falls quiet at night, when the desert wind sweeps across the empty streets, those memories rise again. But Juarez is also a warning, not only to Mexico, but to the world. When poverty collides with power, when borders become gateways for billions in contraband, when corruption seeps through every level of authority, then cities do not just suffer. They fracture. They bleed. They become battlefields. Juarez is the proof. And yet, in this very place of violence, hope still stirs. Murals bloom on concrete walls. Children dance in plazas once soaked with blood. Artists, teachers, and parents refuse to let Juarez be defined only by death. This, too, is part of the story. But the cartels never truly leave. Their presence is quieter now, less visible, but always there, in the fear that lingers when headlights appear too slowly at night, in the silence that falls when SUVs roll past. The city knows. Everyone knows. The shadow is still there. Waiting. Watching. So Juarez continues. Between hope and fear. Between memory and survival. Between the scars of yesterday and the uncertainty of tomorrow. For the people here, there is no forgetting. The bridges may be empty now, but the ghosts remain. And what of us? What lesson does Juarez leave behind for the world watching from afar? Perhaps it is this: that no wall, no border, no distance can contain the hunger for power, or the cost of corruption. That when the war comes, it is not the soldiers, nor the bosses, who suffer most, but the ordinary. The mothers. The fathers. The children. Juarez is their story. And so, Juarez stands. A city of blood. A city of resilience. A city that was brought to its knees, yet never disappeared. But its scars will never fade. Its warnings will never soften. And its story is not over. The bridges are empty. The bodies are gone. But the memory of Juarez, the memory of what once hung there, will never, ever be forgotten. Before we leave Juarez, we must remember, this story was never only about cartels or power. It was about people whose lives were cut short. Every name is a life, every life a story. None should be forgotten. Families lit candles so their memory would burn against the darkness. Yet as the sun rises, Juarez continues, scarred, but unyielding. The bridges may be empty now, but their memory lives on. If this story moved you, share it, so the world never forgets Juarez. Subscribe for more stories that must be told.